we're going to talk about the Atlantic economy in the 18th century and how three major imperial powers compete against each other in order to facilitate the shipment of millions of human beings across the Atlantic Ocean in order to make money. So hooray for transporting slaves in order to make money. To begin, we have to understand this economic theory known as mercantilism. And it really implies that the success in the economy is really tied hand in hand with success in the state. And you'll remember this from when we studied Colbert under Louis XIV in France and really his policies. He is a mercantilist policymaker. And really countries try to, they base this idea off. They base this economic theory off the idea that there's a finite amount of wealth in the world, and they should do whatever they can to gather it all. And that's known as bullionism, but it's tied to mercantilism here. And so countries do whatever they can to protect their economy. And the way they do this mostly is to create a favorable balance of trade. That is where they are taking in more gold than they are spending. They have a higher number of exports than they do imports. This allows the country to make more money. They want to, increase the amount of gold that they have. And they also raise tariffs, which are taxes on manufactured goods, from external items so that there's less of an incentive to buy from somewhere else. So, say for instance, we're making a wool coat. If it's made within your country, there's a $5 tax on it. If it's made somewhere else, they might tax it $10, $20, $25. That way you're more likely to buy from the person who makes it within your country because it should, in theory, be more affordable. That is mercantilism. It's very isolationist, it's very protectionist, and it's designed so that these nations compete against each other. And it's practiced by all European nations at this time in the 17th and 18th centuries. And we'll look specifically at how it manifests itself in England. And mercantilism in England is really that's where it hits its high point. England is probably the best at this theory because it really relies heavily upon having colonies, and you'll see why in a second here. So to really hone in on their mercantilism, England passes something called the Navigation Acts, and you may remember these from when we studied Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell passes the first one in 1651. In 1660 and 1663, Charles II, under the restored monarchy, passes a few more to make some minor adjustments to it. And there it pretty much stays for about 100 years. But the law is really pretty straightforward. Any goods coming into England have to be on British-owned ships. That way, any money that may be made is being made by British people. Money is not disappearing onto the continent. This keeps the money within the British Isles, it keeps them wealthy, and it keeps them productive, or so the theory goes. And in addition to this, the colonies can only buy goods that are made in Britain. They could only trade their raw materials with Great Britain. They could not trade with anybody else. The British monopolize their colonies' raw materials, and this allows them to then make manufactured goods for cheap and undercut their competition. Now, they could sell that for a lot more in their colonies because they own a monopoly there, but they can undercut the competition on the continent. The idea behind this is that it would protect the British merchants and farmers, it would allow them to be competitive, and it would allow them to sell more things within the British Empire. And this is why it's key to have all these colonies, because if you've only got one small little colony, then it doesn't really matter how much you can manufacture because you can't sell enough of it. But the British are the biggest colonial empire in the world. They surpassed Spain very, very shortly, right around this time. So they have tons of markets. They can sell to Canada. They can sell to North American colonies. They have some Central American colonies down in Africa, to India, to Australia. All across the globe, they can sell these manufactured goods. And so this is how the British create their mercantilist system, and it really is a way of economic warfare. It isolates your enemies from being able to sell goods, and these initial navigation acts are targeted specifically at England's main commercial rival in the 1600s, and that is the Dutch. The Netherlands is the main competition with their Dutch East India Company, and so that makes it difficult. for the British to compete there. So they create this system that essentially isolates the Dutch from trading with the British Empire. And of course, the Dutch and others don't take too kindly to this, so this naturally leads to war. There are a series of wars that the British fight with the Dutch in the 1600s, and this knocks the Dutch very quickly out of this imperialistic economic picture and raises Britain to the top. They are followed very closely by France. And so what we see is a series of wars between France and England in the 1700s that really could truly be called world wars if you wanted to stretch the definition. And we've studied the first two of these already, and the third one a bit as well. And they begin in Europe, spread out throughout the rest of the world, and end with Great Britain being the dominant power. So the first is the War of Spanish Succession, when Louis XIV tries to put his grandson on the throne of Spain. England doesn't like that. A host of other nations don't like that as well. They defeat Louis XIV. He's forced to sign the Peace of Utrecht, which turns over a decent amount of North American territory from the French to the British. Not a huge amount, but it's a decent amount. It puts a dent into the French colonial ambitions. And so you start to see that this war is mostly fought in Europe, but it stretches a little bit into the colonies. The second war is the War of Austrian Succession, and we've studied this as well, when Frederick the Great claims that Maria Theresa does not have the right to inherit the land of Silesia because she's female, and so launches an attack. The French and the British very quickly take sides. They're always looking for ways to dig at each other because they're in such intense economic competition. The result of this War of Austrian Succession is essentially a stalemate. Not a whole lot changes, at least where the French and the British are concerned. And then the end battle is the 7 Years' War, where we know it here in the United States as the French and Indian War. It's obviously a 7-year war where Maria Theresa attempts to take back Silesia, drags France and England back into this war. And the war is mostly fought on the continent until Britain finally turns its attention to North America. And it is on this attack where the British take Canada, and they and Spain divide up French territorial holdings in North America so that France is essentially ousted from the colonial game. This allows Britain to be the main imperial power in the world. And this is really where we start to see the rise of this concept of the British Empire, so grand that allegedly the sun never sets on it. And that's a result of these economic wars that begin in Europe but have huge colonial consequences. Okay, so we're talking about the economy in the Atlantic. So let's talk a little bit about what labor looks like in the colonies. There's two types of immigrants that go to the American colonies. Obviously those who are free, and then those who are forced. Those are the slaves. The reason why free people immigrate to the Americas is because there's so much land. And this is coming on the heels of a massive population growth and boom in Europe. These people are finding themselves in need of land. Imagine you're the 4th, 5th, 6th son of a farmer. You don't want that farmland divided into 6 plots. Suddenly you don't have enough to feed your family. But if you move to the Americas, you have that opportunity. So that's why you see all these farmers move over. Now, not everyone came of their own volition. We have, of course, the legacy of the slave trade. And so from 1450 to 1900, you have over 1 million Africans forced to the Americas. And that does not include the number of Africans who die along the way, which is at least a few million. So you have huge numbers coming here. The slave labor is more prominent in South America than North America, but it exists everywhere. Of course, the southern British colonies are more likely to have slavery than the Atlantic or New England colonies. And the slave trade is obviously horrific. We've learned a lot about it in the past, but we'll just touch on it briefly. European exploiters, I will call them, venture to Africa. They oftentimes get in touch with kingdoms there, and these kingdoms then trade slaves to the Europeans for manufactured goods and oftentimes weapons so that they can go then get more slaves. Now, the Europeans, and this is going to be important to remember when we come back during imperialism, are not being honest in their dealings with these African countries, and they're giving them weapons, but they're either intentionally broken, old and outdated, essentially useless, so that they're getting slaves and not really equipping these Africans in order to be able to fight back. So you kind of have that going on. The slaves then move over across the Atlantic to the Americas, where they produce raw materials, which are transported back to England to create manufactured goods, which then go to Africa for more slaves. It is the triangle trade with which we are all familiar with. And so that really leads to these two different sets of labor in the colonies. Now, in the middle of these two, which is not on this slide, is this idea of these indentured servants, which are people who are forced into labor for a set term, usually about 7 years, upon which they are freed. And that's kind of in between, certainly more free than forced. And we'll look at the impact of this trade is that, again, it's this triangular trade network, and it really transforms the European economy. So from the 1400s through the 1700s, England mostly traded wool to Europe. That was really their market, was Europe, and they had the best wool. But starting in the 1700s, these other European countries are adopting these mercantilist policies. And this really hurts England's overseas trade. They're not able to ship wool into the Netherlands or to Germany or to France, as we saw Colbert was trying to create his own textile industry. So they have to find somewhere else. And that's when they start looking to their colonies. And this really diversifies their trade, because these colonies need more than simply clothes. They need all these manufactured goods. They don't have the legacy, the skilled artisans in order to create these manufactured goods. This jewelry, clocks, weapons, you name it. Those are all manufactured in England and then transferred elsewhere. And because they have so many colonies, the demand skyrockets, which allows the English economy to grow rapidly. So you see tons of money, tons of goods, shifting all throughout mostly the English Empire, although all Europeans are involved in this in some capacity. So we see huge growth in places like London and other English cities, and we see the rise of cities. So trade really transforms from being between continental countries and England to suddenly becoming a global enterprise where each country is only trading with their colonies. The country that has the most colonies, of course, has the most money, and that is England. It is around this time as well that we have to come to get to know a very important figure in European history, and that is Adam Smith. And Adam Smith is a Scottish economist, and he writes a really famous book that's definitely absolutely worth knowing, known as The Wealth of Nations. And in this, Adam Smith really critiques mercantilism and puts forward a new economic theory known as economic liberalism or free market capitalism. And his argument against mercantilism is pretty straightforward. He argues that it really limits economic growth because you are obviously limited in your market. It has too many regulations. The government is far too involved in this for it to be successful and profitable, and it gives unfair privileges for government monopolies and favorites. The government can control who's allowed to trade with whom, and if you are a higher up in government and your brother starts a company, well, you're going to favor him significantly more often than anybody else. And so he looks at this system and goes, look, this really isn't going to work. We need something new. And this is when he writes for something called free market competition, which is essentially a deregulation where the government's not involved. People set their own prices. They can trade with anybody. And he argues that this system will protect consumers because it will protect them from price gouging, really, because they can buy from anyone in the world who's creating this. And there would be a lot more people creating this, so prices will go down. It would give everyone a fair chance because you wouldn't have to fight against the government monopolies. And he does this in part because he dislikes the government. He argues that the government should serve very few functions. First, they should provide defense against foreign invasion. So protection. And then they should undertake to create massive public works and large institutions that would be not profitable or basically impossible for individuals to do. That would be roads, sewers, universities, things of that sort the government needs to take on. But besides that, he doesn't want to see the government involved in the economy at all. And he pushes for this idea called the invisible hand. And this is the invisible hand of free competition that would kind of guide this economy along and keep it on track. And he really believes that this competition will keep people honest, it will keep prices low, and it will be fair for everybody. And so this is a new concept. And it comes to light in the mid to late 1700s. And it's not always readily adopted, especially not in Europe. They're still very distrusting of each other. They don't believe in this idea of economic liberalism and this free market capitalism. They want to isolate themselves and protect themselves. But this becomes foundational in the development of the United States and later in the European order, kind of after the Napoleonic era. So we'll look to see Adam Smith pop up again in the future.